This week's vlog question raises a question about a couple of similar but different emotions. The writer asks, they say, I've been listening to many of your seminars and I've noticed that you emphasize the distinction between how the gospel speaks to sin and suffering. And this seems to correlate with the way that you use words like guilt and shame. If I'm right about this, do you mind taking a few minutes to describe the difference and between those two words and maybe any other emotional experiences that would be similar and important to differentiate? I would begin by saying you're right in picking up on this key point of emphasis, that we do emphasize the difference between the way the gospel speaks to and comforts suffering versus the way that the scriptures speak to and offer forgiveness for sin. And that does play out in the way that I frequently use the words guilt and shame. I would also throw into the mix there the word regret that I think has a similar experience. Now, when we think about these words, guilt, shame, and regret, I think one of the things that we realize is that they feel very similar. It's not like I can just take my emotional temperature, get a sense for what's going on inside of me, and just automatically go, this is what makes them different. Because they share some important things in common. Each of them are unpleasant. When I feel any of these, there's this natural instinct to want to hide and to cover up. Frequently, I'm embarrassed and I don't want to talk about these emotions with others. When I feel these things, I feel dirty. I feel damaged. I feel bad. And there's a sense that when I feel these things, I think they define me. And not only is the experience of these emotions similar, but they tend to be triggered by the same kinds of events. I tend to feel these things when something happened that was wrong and I was a part of it. I may have done it, it may have happened to me, it may have just been around me, but there was something wrong that happened and I was a part of it. Socially, there is this stigma that gets attached from whatever that happened that makes me feel unacceptable. And also, the memory of these triggering events seems to be very sticky. It's hard for me to let go of. It's the kind of thing that I would replay over and over again in my mind. Now, I would argue that these different emotions, when rightly understood and rightly interpreted, that they are three distinct emotions that the gospel speaks to in unique ways. So let's start with some basic definitions. Guilt. Guilt is the legitimate sense of condemnation when I've done something wrong, when I've committed a personal sin. Shame, as we're using the word, is a sense of illegitimate condemnation that I feel in response to suffering. It's when something happens to me that was wrong, and yet I still feel this sense of stigma. That's what we're calling shame. And regret is a form of grief when there was some good circumstance that could have or maybe even should have happened that was never realized. So we begin to ask ourselves, what does that mean? What does that look like? When would I experience guilt? I would say we rightly experience guilt maybe when we lose our temper, when we misrepresent the truth or lie, when we fail to fulfill a promise, when we neglect some responsibility, when we dishonor an authority figure, when we make a cruel joke, when we take advantage of someone, or in some other way we misrepresent the character of Christ in our life and to those around us. In those kinds of moments, if we do not feel guilty, then our conscience is seared, and that's a problem. Now we say, okay, I get guilt. That's what that is. When do we feel shame? It that would be when I've been abused, maybe physically, emotionally, sexually. When I live in chronic pain. When I've been betrayed by a spouse or a trusted friend, when I lose my job for some reason that was outside of my control, when I observe a catastrophe and I just feel helpless and I want to do more than I can, or I experience the hardships that come as a result of somebody else's sin in some other way. Now, if in the midst of that shame, I own those emotions, I think they belong to me, that I merit them in the same way that I do when I feel guilt, then in that moment I'm feeling a false sense of condemnation. So that's when I experience guilt. That's when I experience shame. What about regret? Regret we might experience when a parent died and we were still young. An illness or injury prevents us from pursuing a good dream that we have for our life. An opportunity that would be nice doesn't come our way, or some other legitimate desire proves to be unfulfilled. Now, if I take those moments of regret and I interpret those as God's rejection of me or a reflection of my value, then what's happening there is I am over personalizing these events to give them a message that they were never intended by God to carry, and I get this false sense of condemnation again. And so, okay, if that's what they are, then how does the gospel respond to each one of those in a unique way? I would say for guilt, the gospel offers forgiveness. Guilt leaves a moral stain. I've done something wrong. It is a reflection of my character. It needs to be removed. And the blood of Christ is what washes away that moral stain on my soul. And more than just washing it away, it replaces it with the righteousness of Christ. Sin does not become my identity because the gospel transforms me from being a rebel against God to being a child of God. And so again, if the gospel offers offers forgiveness for guilt, we ask the question, what does it offer for shame? For shame, the gospel offers comfort and truth that counters the lies that we are so prone to believe during our suffering. When we're suffering, life is hard, and it is very easy for many lies to get introduced into our world. We begin to think we deserve this. After all, we're all sinners. Maybe I deserve this suffering, or that this is the only kind of thing that happens to me, or many other lies that we can begin to embrace and believe to try to make sense out of our suffering. And so God, in response to our suffering, offers us comfort, and he also begins to counter those lies. The problem is that we begin to comfort ourselves with those lies. They're the understanding that we use to try to make life predictable and make sense. And so God is very patient in the way that he takes those lies from us as we're willing to surrender them to him. And so if that's what the gospel does for shame, what does the gospel offer for regret? I would say that the gospel offers the assurance that we live in the providence of a good God. The gospel reveals the character of God in whose providence we live out life. Now, the gospel doesn't ask us to call things that are painful or things that are unfortunate and just say, no, those things are really good. It doesn't cause us to live in that kind of denial. But it does reveal the character of a God who redeems even the darkest moments, even of an event like Calvary, for his glory and our good. And so some questions that I would leave you with to consider, just to help you make application of this post. When and how have you confused the experiences of guilt and shame and regret? When have you treated them as if they were all the same thing, or it was only guilt, or it was only shame? And how has this confusion caused you to resist the help that God offers? And if you took the time to to divide your emotional laundry a little bit better, to where you begin to say, this is guilt, and this is shame, and this is regret, and this is what God offers for each one of those, how would it help you to avail yourselves to the comfort and hope that God gives you through the gospel? Now, those are some big questions, and I'm going to put several resources below this video, hopefully to help you unpack that journey further if you realize this is a journey you need to take. Thank you for taking the time to listen.